Hello everybody, this is Angela. Welcome to my channel. Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to um, finish up Who Was Helen Keller. And the next one that we're going to do is Who Was Jane Austen. She is next on my reading list. So let's get into this. It's getting good. Chapter 8 of Who Was Helen Keller. I don't know if my dog wants up here or not, but she's gonna have to wait. Chapter 8 Cambridge Years. In the early 1900s, few women went to college, and no deafblind woman had ever completed college. But Helen was determined to be the first, and she knew just where she wanted to go, Radcliffe. It was the sister school of Harvard University just outside Boston. Radcliffe was considered the top women's college in the United States. It would be an amazing accomplishment for Helen to become a student there. Helen learned of a way that she could gain admittance to Radcliffe. There was a school, the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, that prepared young women at Radcliffe. Annie went to see Arthur Gilman, the head of the Cambridge School. She pleaded with him to take Helen as a student. Surprised by the request, he said that he would think it over. Helen Helen had no choice but to wait. His answer would determine Helen's future. It was during this time that Helen's father died. Helen wanted to rush home for the captain's funeral, but her mother wouldn't permit it. It was summer with many contagious diseases drive in the south. Helen's mother did not want to risk Helen's health, so Helen had to stay in Massachusetts and grieve for the captain. Then at last Gilman gave his answer. Helen was accepted. For the first time, Helen felt afraid of going to school. What if she did not do as well as the other girls? What if she failed? At first, Helen seemed like any other student at the school. She and Annie lived in House, one of the dorms. Helen made friends. Some of the girls learned the manual alphabet so they could talk to Helen. She joined them in games and took long walks with them. Helen studied English, history, Latin, and German. Sorry about that. A few of the textbooks were in Braille. Annie had to read each one to her. Annie also had to look up words Helen did not know, even if the words were in German or French. Helen worked very hard. She studied day and night. Helen wanted to finish school in 3 years. Was she working too hard? Most students spent 5 years at Mr. Gilman's school. Stubborn as always, Helen refused to back down. The constant study took its toll. Helen became ill. Her sister, Mildred, now also attended the school. Mildred noticed that Helen seemed weak and was always tired. Mrs. Keller became alarmed when Annie pushing her daughter too hard. Mrs. Keller met with friends of Helen. Should she take Helen away from Annie? Mr. Gilman thought so. Helen and Annie had been together for almost 10 years. Wherever Helen went, Annie did too. Perhaps it was time for Helen to make a break with Teacher. Helen did not want Teacher to leave. Helen felt she would be lost without Teacher. Mrs. Keller wavered. She was not sure. In the end, Mrs. Keller sided with Annie. Annie would remain with Helen. Helen withdrew from Mr. Gilman's school. She and Annie went to live in Rimmans, Massachusetts. There, Helen worked with a private tutor. Nothing would stop Helen from entering Radcliffe. In June 1899, Helen took the test for Radcliffe. She was already 19 years old. Many freshmen at Radcliffe were only 18. Helen was afraid she had failed, but she passed with good marks. Finally, on July 4th, 1899, the accompanying letter came. The fireworks for the holidays seemed to be just for Helen, but the dean of Radcliffe suggested that Helen would wait a year before entering. To Helen, that seemed like forever. In September 1900, Helen entered Radcliffe as a freshman. In the wonderland of mine, Helen said, I should be as free as another. Helen's dream had come true. Chapter 9. College Years. So Helen began her college years. As hard as the Cambridge school had been, Radcliffe seemed impossible. There was never enough time. Annie spelled lectures into Helen's hands. Annie read the textbooks to Helen. It seemed as though they were on a treadmill. There was no time for rest, or Helen would fall behind. And Helen felt alone. She and Annie lived in a small house off campus. It was away from the girls in Helen's classes. The girls were friendly, but many did not know what to say or how to act around Helen. Others felt odd. Helen was famous, so with a quick handshake, the girls ran off. And Helen was always working. She had no time to play, think, or daydream. She always had a paper due, a lecture to memorize, or a test to take. Helen's first year in college was hard and lonely. In her second year, Helen began to write themes. The themes were stories of her life. An editor of the magazine, Ladies' Home Journal, heard about the themes. He asked Helen if the magazine could publish them. He offered Helen the sum of $3,000. Helen was amazed. That was a lot of money. Helen agreed, and so she began the story of my life. I have read that. It is a really good book. Each month, the magazine published a new chapter in Helen's story. The first one went fine, but Helen handed in the second chapter late. The story was much too long. Neither Helen nor Annie knew how to edit. What were they to do? Friends told them about a fine editor named John Macy. John helped Helen edit the articles. The magazine loved the pieces, and so did the public. By the time the last chapter appeared in the August issue, the world was in love with Helen Keller. John Macy thought that Helen's stories could be made into a book. John added Helen's childhood letters and a section describing how Annie taught Helen. Helen's book, The Story of My Life, became a hit. It is still in print today. It has been published in more than 50 languages. Now Helen had a career as a writer. No one could ever say that this was not her story. It was her life. In June of 1904, Helen Keller graduated with honors from Radcliffe. Newspapers around the world reported the event. Helen had achieved what no other person with her handicap had ever done. Now she had a college degree, but what was she going to do with it? Annie also had big questions to decide. She and John Macy had fallen in love. He wanted to marry her, but what? Annie wondered. But what? Annie wondered what would happen to Helen. Could she have lead a more independent life? Annie wanted to marry John Macy, so they did in 1905. Helen lived with them. As for Helen, she kept on with her life too. She published a second book, The World I Live In. It came out in 1908 and told of Helen's world. It described how she used her senses of touch, smell, and taste to make up for her two missing ones. The book also revealed Helen's wonderful imagination and how she pictured her world. The book was a hit, but Helen wanted to support herself. The money from the book was not enough to do that. How else could Helen make a living? Chapter 10. Helen was also asked to give a public speech. Helen gave her first speech in Montclair, New Jersey. Annie was sitting with her still. Helen was scared. What if no one understood her? But Helen spoke about her life. Her voice was not clear, but no one seemed to care. The audience loved her. Helen was asked to give more speeches. So Helen and Annie went on a lecture tour. They toured different cities in the United States. In 1913, she spoke about her life and her feelings and how she accomplished what she did. Annie introduced Helen and then spoke again at the end. At the end, warm and heartfelt applause greeted Helen wherever she went. Helen was so successful on stage that some people invited her to make a movie about her life and her feelings. Helen and Annie went to Hollywood and made the silent film Deliverance. Annie and Helen dreamed of the money they'd make from the film. They hoped to become rich and famous like movie stars. But the movie was not a success. Disappointed, Helen and Annie returned to Weimar, and now they had a new problem. Annie's eyesight was failing, and Annie and John had separated. Annie was hurt over the failure of her marriage, and she feared she would go blind. The two rested. Helen answered many letters that she received. Helen was famous, but they were broke. Helen had to think of ways to earn money. Then an offer came. New York vaudeville agents met with Helen and Annie. Vaudeville was a stage show made of a series of different acts. The agents discussed whether the two women might do a 20-minute act about Helen and her teacher. Annie and Helen's friends did not like the idea. Helen made Helen's mother hated the idea. People would come just to see a blind and deaf woman, but Helen didn't care. She thought that it would be fun. And as always, once again, Helen decided to do something. There was no change in her mind. The first performance was on February 24th, 1920, at the Palace Theater in New York City. Teacher opened the act in her Irish brogue. She told how she first taught Helen. Music then filled the theater. Helen parted the curtain and walked on stage. Then they told of the miracle the day Annie spelled the word water, and Helen realized what it meant. At the end of their act, the audience exploded with applause. Helen had charmed them completely. Soon Helen and Annie were among the highest paid performers. They earned up to $2,500 a week. Annie began to worry that people came to see if Helen would fall off the stage or make some other mistake. Maybe some did, but most did not. They came because they admired Helen, and Helen loved vaudeville. She liked talking to the other performers. She loved the smell backstage. Helen said that she felt like part of a family. In 1924, Helen started a new job, one that was to last the rest of her life, the American Foundation for the Blind, asked Helen to work for them. She would meet people, talk about the blind, and raise funds. Helen accepted. She felt that there was no a way to help the blind everywhere, and so Helen became an ambassador for the blind. She met kings, queens, and presidents. Annie went with her. In 1925, Helen took a year off to write another book. Helen had been asked to write about the most recent years of her life. She wrote about her last years at Radcliffe, the foundation for the blind, and the people in her life. In 1929, Midstream was published. It too became a bestseller. 1929 was also the year that the stock market crashed. The Great Depression began. Millions of people in the United States lost their jobs and their money. Annie became ill. Her sight grew worse and worse. Later, she lost her sight. Helen's heart broke for Teacher. She made sure that Teacher was well taken care of. A secretary named Polly Thompson began to fill in for Annie. Then in 1936, Annie Sullivan died. For nearly 50 years. Teacher had been the center of Helen's life. Could Helen live without her? Many people thought Helen would collapse or fade away, but she didn't. In her heart, Helen knew she had to go on. She could not retreat from the world. Teacher never would have wanted that, so Helen kept on working with just Polly, with, with just Polly's help. Helen continued to speak for the foundation. She met with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, who had polio. He had braces on his legs and used a wheelchair. The two proved that people could overcome severe handicaps and achieve great things. Helen worked to pass laws to help the blind. The blind would receive money for schools and job training. Funds were given to make talking books available in public libraries. These laws helped the blind live independently. Helen toured Japan in the late 1930s. The Japanese people knew of Helen Keller, but many did not believe the stories about her in Japan. The blind were treated very poorly. They received little schooling or help from the government. Helen's tour changed that. Knowing that Helen loved dogs, the Japanese people gave her a beautiful Akita doll. The gift showed how much they respected her. Helen then returned home. After World War II ended in 1945, Helen traveled all over the world once more. She met with blind soldiers. Helen inspired them. She gave them hope. Helen continued to speak out for the handicapped for the rest of her life. She met with every president from Grover Cleveland to John F. Kennedy. In 1955, Helen published another book, Teacher Annie Sullivan Macy. Annie Sullivan Macy. It was about the life of the person who had in many ways given Helen her life. On Broadway, a play called The Miracle Worker opened in 1959. It too told the story of young Helen and Teacher. Later, the play was made into a popular movie. Helen died on June 1st, 1968. She was nearly 88 years old. She had inspired millions. Her story continues to inspire us today. Well, that's the end of Who Was Helen Keller. So, I mean, she was, I mean, what a wonderful person. And so I hope you all enjoyed that. Please hit like and subscribe to my channel. Please hit the notification bell so you'll know when I come up with a new video. And I hope to see you in the next one. Y'all have a good one and good night.